Deputy Montfort-Taddy. I'm the chair of the panel.
Deputy Karen Wilson, member of the panel.
Deputy Max Andrews, a member of the panel.
I'm Deputy Kirsten Morel, Minister for Sustainable Economic Development.
I'm Chris Kelleher. I'm Policy Officer for Culture, Arts and Heritage and Events for the Department of Economy.
Olivia Chaplin, the Sector Lead for the Visitor Economy and Retail in the Department for the Economy.
Dan Hasker, Group Director for the Economy.
Thank you. I'm going to pass over to Deputy Andrews to ask the first questions.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for being in attendance, Minister. I'd like to firstly start off this public hearing by asking you a question in relation to why you believe that the regulations ought to be changed moving forward in the future.
Yeah, I mean, the triennial regulations, as they're kind of commonly referred to, has been calls from many different quarters about the need to change them. One of them is, one of the reasons to change them is the slight absurdity of having a set of regulations which are in constant use, but which every 3 years need to be re-clarified, I guess, or re-voted on by the states. So there is just that kind of administrative level, but also there's a desire within the events industry and the hospitality industry to move onto a different footing for the events licensing regime. And so there's calls from the public as well as kind of calls from within the political sphere, I'd say, from people around the table, that the events licensing regime needs to be changed.
And do you believe there are other aspects of Jersey's legislation as well that probably ought to be modernised in line with what we're speaking about today as well?
I mean, I'm sure there are many areas of the entire kind of legislative book that need to be changed, but in my particular area, matters which come to mind are the liquor licensing law.
Yep.
That's definitely somewhere that we're already working on. We're already working on the heritage law as well, which is an area which needs to be updated and brought into modern focus.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Minister.
Is there a philosophical problem with where the legislation currently sits?
There is, definitely for some people. It's something that personally I'm more relaxed about, but I also do understand that, at the moment the events licensing regime sits with the bailiff and the judiciary. In itself, that's unusual in a kind of modern society, and I really do understand that. And so, yes, definitely in some quarters there is a philosophical kind of desire, or there's a desire to see it changed on philosophical grounds.
Yeah. You don't have a problem with it yourself?
From the pragmatic perspective of it's a system which does work. From that perspective, that's why I'm relaxed. It's a system, it seems to work.
Yeah.
We haven't had events in Jersey that I can remember, which have been out of control, or we don't have a history in modern times of events taking place which don't have permission. And I was thinking about why did these regulations come in the first place. It was 1992. And whilst I don't know hand on heart that this is the reason, that coincides with that time at the end of the 1980s when raves were becoming a phenomenon in the UK, certainly. And whilst I was about 15, around that time, 14, 15, if I remember rightly, there were a few kind of raves taking place in Jersey as well. So I think it may have been out of that era, or that these regulations were brought in.
Could I just ask then, because we have received some evidence already, as you'd imagine, and there is a school of thought out there which says that the current system works very well. I think there's an understanding that, like you say, these regulations shouldn't need to be renewed every 3 years. There could be a permanent system in place. But there are those who say, like you've said, that it works very well. Why change it from its current home? Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so, I mean, it depends which element you want to look at it. So at the moment, it lies in the judiciary. It is the bailiff that gives permission to events. That in a modern society is unusual. The judiciary would be involved in that way. You would ordinarily want it, to be on the kind of democratically elected side of your government functions, and then usually delegated in some way through ministerial authority. There are definitely kind of shortcomings if you're an event organiser, if you've been doing events in Jersey for quite a long time, I think you then know the system and it becomes like any system that you get to know, you become adept at navigating that system. So if you're a regular events organiser in Jersey, I think in the main, you would know how to navigate the system and do it. If you're new to events organisation in Jersey, I think then it does become quite unusual as a system, because not only do you have to go and get the permission from the bailiff, but you also have to look at other sets of laws, such as the licensing law, the policing of beaches law, and a number of other laws that can impact on your event. And so one element of kind of changing regulations is also looking at those other laws and trying to make it simpler to bring where your event does touch other laws, make it simpler to kind of bring that all together for events organisers.
Yeah.
To your understanding, Minister, what defines an event?
It's a really very good question. It's one of the, as we seek to change these regulations, that's one of the questions we have to ask ourselves. So the question to me isn't what constitutes an event, it's what constitutes a public event. And because I can have an event at my home, I don't need permission for that. It's so I think the main things are you taking money? Is it for commercial gain? A lot of the time is part of it. Not all events are for commercial gain, but are they also being held in a public place? Even so there, even if it's not for commercial gain, you're holding it on public land in a public place. They're there and you're inviting the public to take part in them. That's when you start to need to look at the protections and from the public, from a health and safety perspective and so on, as to whether your event needs to fall under these regulations.
Okay, thank you. The regulations establish a penalty of imprisonment for up to 6 months,
Yes.
an unlimited fine, or both, for an offence of holding a public entertainment without the permission of the bailiff,
Right.
or contravening a condition of the permission given. Are these penalties appropriate?
Well, again, they're appropriate from the perspective that they align with UK penalties for holding events without the appropriate permissions from the authorities in the UK, so they're not out of step with other jurisdictions. I don't always, as people around the state will know, I don't always look to the UK as my guide, but by looking at another jurisdiction, you can help to understand whether the legislation we have is appropriate or not. So it's not out of step with UK legislation. Another place we look to when we're designing legislation around penalties is the Attorney General and the Attorney General's office, and they provide a guide as to the appropriate penalties. So from this perspective, I believe the Attorney General was almost certainly consulted back in the early 1990s about the penalties, and as I say, it's not out of step at all with the UK legislation. So from that perspective, I believe it's appropriate. I think it's, if I may, I think it's really important to understand the role the regulations play. And so events, until 1992, when these regulations were brought in, events were entirely held under customary law. And the customary law does not provide maximum levels of penalty. So theoretically, under the previous purely customary law regime, imprisonment was unlimited, whilst the fine remains unlimited. Theoretically, if you were found guilty of an offence under customary law for holding an event without permission of the bailiff, you would not know how long you may be imprisoned for. So one of the reasons for bringing these, I understand one of the reasons for bringing these regulations in kind of 30 or so years ago was to provide maximum penalties. So it's a protection from the public in that respect as well. Or events, it's protection for events organisers in that respect as well.
Yeah.
We had evidence yesterday that one suggestion was that well, first of all, that no prosecutions ever happened under these regulations, which could be seen as a good or bad thing. It might mean that they're effective or that they're not, I guess. There was a suggestion that it might be more of an effective penalty to remove somebody's ability to organise an event for a period of time, in the same way that you might with a liquor licence. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I hadn't thought about it before you putting it before me right now, but that actually does sound like a potentially rational way forward as well as an alternative. Because again, it's very easy to look at maximum penalties and say, oh, you could go to prison for 6 months. The reality, I think, and it's not, I'm not part of the judiciary, but if it was a first offence, you held an event without permission, and especially if nothing had gone wrong from a health and safety perspective, I think it's highly unlikely anyone would be sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for that.
Yeah.
You know, as with all these things, these are maximum penalties. But the idea of a disqualification for a period of time, in the same way that it works for our driving licences and things like this, does sound like an interesting way forward, and one that I'm very happy to ask officers to explore.
Do you have any understanding of the industry's view on the penalties?
I haven't personally asked. The view I have from industry is about the regulations in the system in general, rather than the penalty. So I would have to say, hand on heart, I don't think I do.
Okay. Yeah. Right. Okay. One of the things that we are interested to understand is whether or not the regulations are enforced. And so, in your view, or are you aware of any instances where there has been a penalty issued at all?
No, as the chair said, I don't believe so, and but we do have a healthy events, you know, and have had for the 30 or so years since these regulations came in. We have had all those thousands of events have taken place under these regulations since then. The fact that there have been no convictions suggests, and in the main, again, I struggle to think of an event that went awfully wrong in terms of a public safety perspective. So in that sense, I believe that these regulations have been doing the job intended, and that people are asking for permission. In asking for permission, the bailiff's office, which runs events licensing at the moment, puts on conditions, ensures that health and safety, that fire risks, etc., are taking place. It seems to me that since 1992, that system has been working reasonably, absolutely,
okay.
and to a positive effect.
Can I ask about the possibility of what you might call the counterfactuals, in the sense that not simply about the penalties, but the process itself for applying for an event? Do you have any sense of events that haven't taken place that might have, if we had a different system, which some argue might be a more streamlined, a quicker system, that didn't need 6 months lead-in period, perhaps?
So I have definitely heard of events, or I have heard of people who have told me they haven't put on events because of the system. But sometimes that may well be because they came to it quite late, and it was perhaps an event that they were wanting to put on in a month's time, but they're only starting the process now. Yeah. I couldn't tell you which events. I think it'd be inappropriate to say which events didn't happen. At the end of the day, they're non-events.
But do you think that it should be reasonable if you're a business person and you've got a company and you want to put an event on in 1 month's time in a public place because you're responding to public events, or you've just got a contact who you can get to Jersey, but only in that time? Do you think that's reasonable to be able to turn an event round in a month's time? Do you think it should be possible?
I think it should be possible for people to, there's a lot more than just the licensing that goes into whether you can put an event or not. If you believe, and again, it depends on the scale of event. If it's a relatively small event and you're reacting to some, as you say, some sort of other event or public demand for something, the event in Howard Davis Park at the moment, the football screening event, that has been undertaken in short time. And so, yes, it can be reasonable, I think, for a short time frame to be part of it. What I would say, if I was an event organiser and I only had a month or so to organise my event in, I would ask them to pause and think, can you do it properly in that time frame? It takes a lot of resource to put on almost any event. My experience when I have organised events personally in the past is they almost always take more resource than you thought they would. And so if it is very last minute, I think it's worth checking yourself and thinking, hold on, is it worth doing it in this time frame? Could we find a later date to put on?
Yeah. I mean, there are those who'd say that if you're well connected and you're part of the parish, or you're, dare we even say that you can put on a visit for some very high profile visitors within the space of 2 or 3 weeks, and pull out all the stops, and that can be done. There are those who suggest that if you're in a certain position, you can do it, but if you're a private company, there's a lot of red tape that's involved, and whereas it's been suggested to us that might be expedited. I don't know if that's on your radar.
It's not on my radar, but I could understand why people have that view.
Okay. I think question 2's been answered already, so I won't ask that. And Max, if we're all happy with the progress.
Yeah, there was just one addition, if I could, Minister, which is to just ask whether there will be any alterations that might be beneficial in deterring unlawful public entertainment.
when you say alterations to the current
To the current,
licensing,
yes.
I think from my perspective, it's changing the events regulations and the licensing regime. The benefit is the alterations. The benefit is in making it a simpler system to navigate, but also enabling us to have a more strategic outlook on events. So we've held workshops with event organisers, and one of the key elements that they really wanted was to see a more extended calendar of events, even out to 10 years, so that you can then start planning around. And I was saying 10 years is a very long way away. Yes. How do you do that? But actually, when you think about big sporting events, so we hosted the opening of the Tour de Bretagne many years ago. If we wanted to do that again, that is potentially the sort of event which you would kind of start working on 6 months, 6 years or so, something like that, many years in advance. Yeah. Same with the Island Games. We've booked in the Island Games for 10 years, 11 years' time. So I can, with that in mind, I can see how you actually could start constructing a 10-year calendar of events. And so from the perspective of enabling a simpler system and enabling us to do work on a more strategic approach to events in Jersey, because I think events are absolutely vital for many reasons in Jersey. I think those are the main benefits.
Before we move on to you, Matt, just whilst I think of it, that, it's very simple to organise an event. We've been told if you've got a venue which is already registered for events, that's got a rolling event licence. So, for example, at town halls, parish halls, you can put events on there. You don't need to apply for a separate one every time. But it's difficult if you want to put a public event on. So even if it's an area where it might be frequently used for public events, would you give consideration to the possibility to license, if you like, or give permanent or rolling licenses to public places like the Weybridge, like the Royal Square, like People's Park?
Like Haldavis Park.
Haldavis Park, yeah.
I'm happy to give consideration to that. I think the difficulty you have in parks, let's say, is that you can have events of very, very different sizes, which then have very different needs from a health and safety perspective. So, if I'm putting on an event in St Lawrence Parish Hall, the parish hall itself restricts the number of people who can be in that event. In itself, the parish hall has its own fire policies, its own safety policies. The park doesn't in the same way, or open public space doesn't in the same way. So I could understand why it might be really difficult to do that, because, every event, out here we had a large dance event in May, Live in the Square. That's very different to holding the Fête de Nuit in the Royal Square. They would need two different levels and very different kind of health and safety and management regimes around them. And for that reason, I think it'd be quite difficult to do, to have just of the Royal Square's licence for all events, off you go, because each event organiser would still need to be presenting their specific health and safety plans, etc.
So I think the question might be about licensing the individual and having a competent organiser of an event, but the space itself could be seen as an event space. So.
Definitely, and I think most of us would know most of the, you've named some, I've added one, Haldavis Park, the Royal Square, etc. I think most of us know where most of those event spaces are, so in the sense of making it easier that, that's an event space, and yes, what you need to do is then just overlay your own proper management regimes, which need to get a sign-off from somebody in authority. I can see that being absolutely possible.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I note that the Barrier to Business report was published, and you also indicated that you'd like to be reducing red tape to allow the private sector to thrive.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether you believe that the current regulations happen to be bureaucratic, and is there much red tape involved for those who do try and obviously launch events?
I mean, that's the feedback I've been getting from the sector, that they do find it difficult. And as we were saying earlier, particularly people who are new to the sector, yes, it's definitely an area where you become more adept the more events you put on. So in that sense, yes, that is absolutely one of the reasons. And as I said, the fact that individual events can also require the input of other laws and kind of threading that all together, for me, would make life a lot easier for businesses.
And of course, you'll be the responsible minister for bringing forward the primary and potentially the secondary legislation that might then go through into next term as well.
Yeah.
So what alterations are you seeking to see under the legislation to ensure that the private sector can have a more streamlined process?
I mean, we're scoping it out at the moment. So, as I said, we've got the strategic funding framework to support events. That's something we want to do. We are in the process at the moment of scoping exactly how it would work. I don't know if there's anything from Olivia or Darren that you would want to add to that area. I don't think
The
so.
detail hasn't started yet.
That's still to be confirmed, basically.
Could I just say,
yes, of course.
the one thing is the areas are like policing of beaches, policing of parks, which don't fall under the Minister's responsibility.
Beaches does.
Yeah, beaches, but not parks.
Not parks.
No. And then also the roadworks and events legislation, which is kind of another level of legislation top. That's something else we'd like to do. The whole idea is to simplify the legislation, so when you do apply for a licence for an event, it will be a seamless process.
So process is as important as anything else.
Yeah.
You know, as well as just the regulations themselves, having a process which is much easier to know.
Yeah. So yesterday with the panel to public hearings, it was made quite clear that, you know, it's quite usual to see an event take about 6 months to be approved. So do you believe that time is acceptable, or do you believe it should be a lot less?
Yeah. So again, I need to caveat my response, with, you know, it's always on a case-by-case basis. As I said, I have organised events in the past, some of them extremely large events. You know, I've worked on them for a year in advance. But you're talking specifically about the approval process.
Yes.
You know, I would like to think it would be possible that even the largest events could be approved in a shorter time frame. But that means that you would also have to make sure, you know, if I'm organising a large event, approval is going to be faster if I've already got a health and safety, fire permissions, you know, spoken to the police about numbers, things like this. That will help speed up the approval process. Yeah. So I think there is a balance to be struck in the sense that, yes, we can make the process simpler. That could make the approval system faster. But if as an event organiser, you haven't done your work in advance, well, that will delay. You know, if you're drip feeding your kind of crowd management plan and your fire safety plan, if you're drip feeding it into the authority that approves or otherwise, then it's going to slow down the process, and the authority can't do anything about that.
No. Thank you very much. Okay, Chair.
Thank you. I suppose we can move on to what we might consider the meat, in some ways, of why we called this in. So I think there's a lot of agreement around the table in terms of, probably, in terms of that there's a lot of agreement in the Assembly about the fact that these regulations should be the last time they're lodged, and that there's something to replace them. And so I think the question that we have, and hence our amendment, really relates to Article 6 about how long these regulations should last for. So you've already given us an indication that I think it's Article 6, you can tell me if I'm wrong.
5, I think.
5? Is it 5?
Regulation 5 specifies the expiry date of the regulation.
Thank you for clarifying that. I should have it in front of me.
I didn't know it off the top of my head.
No, thank you. So you've already said that you want to come back with primary legislation before this term ends. Do you know roughly when you would seek to lodge that and have it debated?
Before the end of the term is probably the best I can give you there. I mean, we will try to do everything we can to get all of it, regulations included, before you know, don't get me wrong, that is our ultimate aim. I would love to get it all before the term of this Assembly finishes. I'm being cautious because I know that there are elements of drafting any legislation that are out of the hands of the Minister that I have no time, no real ability to control, and it's because of that reason that I'm asking for the full 3 years. And I think the lodging of these regulations, the current ones before us, is an example. We passed them to law drafting 4 months before law drafting passed them back to us. And so these regulations that we are currently reviewing, you are currently reviewing,
Did you specify?
We're in law drafting for 4 months.
Did you specify when you wanted them
that's
back?
out of my control.
Yeah. Did you specify to law draftsmen when you wanted them back, though, these regulations?
I think we probably made it clear that it was as quickly as possible, but You know,
So the
I
evidence-
don't pass them to law drafting myself, so I don't know.
But we did have the law draft officers in. What they've indicated, that in a sense, I mean, we're not really talking about these regulations. We're talking about the future law.
Well, yes.
So they've effectively told us that this is pretty much a copy and paste job because it's just
That's right.
relodging the
That's
triennial
why I don't
regulations.
understand why
So-
it took 4 months.
But in terms of the new legislation, where do you anticipate the snags are and the hold-up points? What's going to take? So what's going to take the full 2 or potentially longer years to deliver on new regulations?
Well, it appears to have taken 4 months to do what, in your words, Chair, were a copy and paste job. So I have concerns that a more complex primary legislation followed by secondary legislation may take something more than 4 months, and therefore is out of my, and as I say, is completely out of my control. We chased, as I understand it, whilst we lodged regulations in we passed law drafting instructions to law drafters in September 2023. We passed them to the panel as well at exactly the same time or on the same day. We then chased in January, and even after that chasing, it still took about a month to get them back to us.
So is the reason for your cautiousness in part due to you think the law draftsman might take their time in returning this?
Yes, and in that case, it's also because it's brand new primary and secondary legislation. We have the heritage law going through law drafting at the moment. None of this is, it's really important to note, none of this is criticism of law drafters. I don't know their job.
Yeah.
I don't do their job. But, you know, with the heritage legislation, that's been in drafting for a very long time, and partly because it's now also a back and forth.
Yeah.
You know, law drafters, if I may, sorry.
I was just going to say that we have had the Lord. It's a woman actually. It's a law draftswoman.
I said law drafter.
No, I'm just saying it for myself to make sure I get it correct. We did have her in, and it was a public hearing, so all that evidence is on the public record. But can I just put a quote to you from the External Relations Minister when we had him at a quarterly hearing? He said, "Can I just say, in my experience, when people blame the law draftsman for things, that is passing the buck and it's not them at fault." What do you think about that statement?
Well, I'm not blaming the law drafters. There is no blame on my part. All I am saying is that it's an area, that is one of several areas that are out of my control as Minister. And so that's why I'm asking for the full 3 years.
Okay.
Because I cannot control that process. And so again, I mentioned as we come towards the end of a term of office, when I was in my last term in the States Assembly, I was an assistant minister at the end of that term, and I was hoping to get the statistics law, through before the end of the term. The chief minister of the time decided to deprioritise that for perfectly good reasons on his part. He had, as the head of government, he had his own priorities that he wanted to get through. That's another thing that could happen, is the chief minister could say, actually, we're not that interested in these regulations, we want them to wait. So this is not about blaming anybody. I am not blaming the law drafters. All I'm saying is there are various elements of a law drafting process, and by that I mean the whole law drafting process, not just the writing that the drafters do, that are completely out of my control.
So in terms of what's in your control, what level of priority do you give this new legislation?
This is absolutely of the highest priority, alongside some other high priorities, including the licensing law, the liquor licensing law.
We can leave
this
that
is
then.
something I want to get done, if I can, this side of the Assembly.
Thank you.
All I'm being is cautious. I don't want to make promises that I can't deliver on.
Understand.
That's the simple truth.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I was just going to pick up on the point. So if you specified that you wanted this to happen within a 2-year time frame, you can do that, as much as specifying that you want it done in a 3-year time frame. So what you're saying is that you're not specifying in a 2-year time frame because you have some concern about whether or not it can be delivered in that time frame.
Yes, and the reason yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right,
because, and again, it's because of those elements out of my control. If I controlled the whole process, if the whole process effectively was delivered by my officers,
Yes.
I'd feel more comfortable in being able to actually put a deadline and say, we will get this done. I'll have spoken to Dan, we'd have sat there, looked at the department's workloads, reprioritised the workloads accordingly and said, look, we can get this done by then. But because so much of this process is outside of my department, and also, and like I say, towards the end of the term, the Chief Minister will certainly have his own prioritisation. I just don't feel able, I will specify, and everyone here at the table knows we want to try to get this done before the end of this term of office.
Yes.
But I just can't make that promise.
Yeah, I mean,
that's all it
Chair,
really is.
if I may, I would endorse that. I mean, the areas of again, got a good working relationship with law officers. Currently, we've got effectively 10 pieces of legislation that we're trying to amend or create, and invariably, whether it's amending or creating, just the simple process of having the dialogue around clarity. In primary, we've got to go to Privy Council, all of that sort of stuff. In a world where we're constantly reprioritising, does make it very difficult to predict a very definite day that this is going to land. So the closer you get and the further through the process, the more definite you become. But at this stage, I think it's obviously reasonable to be cautious in that sort of context. So we find that in almost every piece of legislation, that we reveal something that we hadn't anticipated. I think it's just effectively part of the process.
As minister, if I may, as minister, I haven't, I've only been a minister for a couple of years, so I haven't done large amounts of legislation. The processes, I'm learning them myself. The main one I have to go on, or the main couple, are the heritage law and the statistics law. And I think the statistics law offers a really interesting element, which is where stakeholders can come from different places that I certainly as minister wasn't expecting. So one of the questions that was raised unexpectedly with regard to the statistics law was from the State's Gref. So the State's Gref came in raising queries about the law, and the scrutiny panel, the corporate services scrutiny panel, is currently looking at their queries. And so that was a stakeholder that I personally hadn't seen as a stakeholder that may come in with their own perfectly valid queries, which in itself then makes you relook at the process. It just slows down the process a bit more. Again, no blame. These are perfectly good queries and perfectly legitimate reasons for slowing things down. So they're totally out of my control.
Can I move this on? So I think just to put more meat on the bones, really. So in a sense, we understand that in an ideal world, you'll be working towards the end of this term to try and bring in both primary and regulations, if that's possible. So we accept that and we take that at face value. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
In terms of what needs to go into the new primary law and the regulations, it would be good to get, although this isn't what we're scrutinising, I think in terms of analysing that time frame and the feasibility of it, can you tell us some of the things that need to be put into the new law and what the key changes are?
So we'd actually have to start with an earlier question, which is a definition of public events. We'd have to have a new authority for licensing those public events. And we'd also have to have, as we were talking about earlier, the kind of linkages to other laws to try to simplify that process.
Could we talk
Those
about
are some elements that I can foresee.
That's very helpful. Can we talk about the authority? Where do you envisage this will sit? Will it be in-house?
In-house, meaning?
Will it be part of the Economic Development Department?
So I imagine it being the Minister for Sustainable Economic Development being the ultimate authority. In my head at the moment, the way I foresee it is that's likely to be a power delegated to somebody else, in the sense that I would think it's unlikely that it would be run by officers. Yes.
So unlikely it would be run by officers.
By officers. So I could imagine delegating it
to an officer.
To another party. So there are regulatory bodies that we currently have.
Okay.
I can imagine potentially using an existing regulatory body as the delegated authority for event licensing.
Well, yeah, okay, I understand that. So there's been a suggestion that it could involve a new commission.
Yeah, and so a new commission on paper using existing regulatory resources. So an existing regulatory body.
Is it right for a regulator to do? I mean, there are different ways to look at it. I suppose one that springs to mind, it may not be a perfect analogy, but you have DBS, which of course is responsible for telling people when they can drive by issuing licences and registering cars, for example, and vehicles. That's done as part of DFI.
Yeah.
Is it not something that could be done in-house by just an administrative process?
It absolutely could be done in-house, but I think then you also bring it closer to the political world. And I think having it independent, so I would not like to think of events being influenced, events licensing being politically influenced. I don't know. I'm the Minister of Economic Development, and if I don't like footballing events, let's say, so I choose then not to.
Okay.
All I'm saying is by putting it into an independent body, you are removing it further from the political process.
Do you think that DBS is political when they decide, when they issue a licence or register a new vehicle.
I think DBS.
They don't say I don't like Jeeps, so I'm not going to register your Jeep. You just have a process which is egalitarian.
But what DBS has is a very clear set of guidelines about the weight, the size, the power, the polluting values of vehicles, and they work within that framework to say, right, if it fits within this framework, we're going to license it. I think of the Citroen Amis, which fell outside of that of that framework, and there was actually a political process, I believe, to try and, we want these Citroen Amis to be licensed in Jersey. Please, DBS, could you look at how you can change or adapt your existing framework to mean that they can be? Again, not something I'm close to. But I think my worry would be just that if you had an economic development minister who didn't even like events, who just felt that he liked the peace and quiet of the Jersey countryside, and so weekender wasn't something they wanted, I wouldn't like to see that political overlay onto the decisions around events licensing.
Is that not then a case of having robust framework? So you could argue, in a sense, that we're already hearing it, that people I don't think the user minds where it sits. So, there might be some users who have a philosophical problem with the bailiff having so many hats, but most of them just want a smooth and clear system.
Absolutely.
Are you saying that an economic development minister would have any direct input into the system if it were in-house?
It's possible. Once it sits in-house, it's much, much closer to the minister.
Couldn't a commissioner have that? So if you couldn't the head of whatever organisation have personal prejudices against music or...
It can be done.
Or jazz.
Yes, of course, that is possible. And also I think it's really important to understand what I'm saying to you here are my thoughts. They are not the roads we are going down. Our process is to have that stakeholder engagement to see how best to play it. Should it sit with the minister? Should it sit with an independent body? My thinking was that in order to make it as depoliticised as possible, an independent body would be better. But it's a personal view, not necessarily what would appear in the law.
One thing we've heard at the moment is that it's incredibly good value for the person or company putting on an event. It's £40, I think, to get a P49.
Yeah.
And you get so much for that in terms of the value and the administration. Is that something you think can you compete with that in terms of the efficiency and cost effectiveness?
It's a very good question, not one I've considered yet.
No.
I'm afraid. I haven't considered that.
You're known as somebody who doesn't want to create unnecessary red tape.
That includes unnecessary pricing as well.
Yeah, but you presumably also want to get some cost recovery from any new system.
It's likely that cost recovery would be a part of that system, but genuinely, I haven't looked at the pricing element of it. So I would want
another day. I think.
Yeah, they absolutely could be. Perhaps as the new system becomes clearer, but it would be. You're right. I think there's a bit of a quandary there because is £40? Does that cover all the cost of the bailiff's office? It sounds like it may not do, as in the bailiff's office may be, in colloquial terms, taking something of a financial hit on that. So, bringing it out of that system may increase the price. That's a possibility. It's not one that it's certainly one that I would want to put pressure on to make sure any price increases were as low as possible, but it's possible that.
And would you envisage a much more digitised system, an online streamlined application system, telling you exactly what you need to submit when, so you can follow it where you are in the application process?
Yes. That's a really simple answer to that one, yes.
Sorry, do come in, but
but in a nice way, that's it.
I think the last one in this one is that we were told yesterday, we heard one piece of evidence that said it's we know businesses need certainty and, event organisers may be individuals as well. And sometimes they might not get this certificate in their hand until a week or even a day before the event. We've been told, on one hand, that's really problematic if you're trying to get the security to run an event.
Yeah.
We were told, on the other hand, by the bailiff's office that it doesn't really matter because an event could be cancelled at the last minute anyway if it doesn't meet certain criteria, so it's kind of academic when you receive that. What's your feeling about the need for certainty in that whole process?
So certainty is one of my touch points for kind of economic and business thinking in general. I take it as a given that for most organisations, not just profit-making businesses, it could be non-profits, any organisation trying to do anything, the environment they're operating in, the greater the certainty of that environment, the easier it is for them to operate. And so the greater the certainty on whether your event is going ahead or not from a bureaucratic perspective, the better it is for the organiser. So having licences issued, let's say with at least off the top of my head, at least 1 month before the event would make it easier for them, because they also have to get insurance. Yes, of course, weather for an external event could cause the cancellation of any event. That's just life. A bureaucratic process is something that's in human control, and therefore the greater the certainty they can give event organisers by providing licences ahead of time, the better it is. Equally though, if you're an event organiser who submitted all your information, as I said earlier, in a kind of drip fashion, or submitted it all very late, you're going to have to put up with the fact that your permission will come through much closer to the time of your event, possibly the day before. Again, it's a balance, but if whichever office undertakes the event licensing, if they can undertake that swiftly, perhaps with, one of the things I imagine we'd seek to do, whether it's in-house in a department or externally with a regulatory function, is to set a kind of code of conduct or service level agreement, that events licensing decisions will be taken within X amount of days or weeks after the final piece of information has been submitted.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I was just going to ask that question about whether you'd be considering a set of standards around that. If I could just move now to the development of the legislation, the new legislation preparation, what kind of measures are you putting in place to ensure that the accountability and the progress is being tracked to develop the legislation? So have you got a programme already lined out? And have you actually issued drafting instructions to lawmakers as yet? And if not, when will you do that?
No, we haven't issued instructions to lawmakers, and that's because we're still in the scoping phase of the work, so we're still at the very beginning of this work, and we're still engaging with stakeholders as to the type of legislation that they would like to see. So until that process is complete, we won't be issuing any law drafting instructions, so we're not at that point yet. We're working with the Jersey Events Partnership. We're going to form the Jersey Events Partnership as a first step. That partnership will oversee the development and delivery of the events framework.
Where's the budget coming out from that?
From my department.
Which, is it coming out of the culture budget?
It could well be, but I don't know if a final decision has been made on that.
No, it will be coming out of the events budget.
Events budget. Is that percentage for arts?
No. It's
Sits in
the
place.
events budget sits in the department budget, the wider department budget. It's not a ring-fenced element. So the steps that we have at the moment are to form a Jersey Events Partnership that will oversee the development and delivery of the framework. We're going to appoint project board members, prepare and agree a strategic plan, and then with those people appointed, the appropriate people appointed, terms of reference and objectives will be set for that. That will then help us move swiftly to the law drafting and beyond.
And does any of that plan include specific timescales for when you're going to be in a state of readiness?
There will be, yeah, because it's a project, so you work from your deadline, which will be the end of this term of office backwards. So you'll have certain milestones in there.
Right, okay. So in terms of the issue about when you anticipate in the lodging of the primary legislation, given you've got that time frame in place, can you just give us an indication of when the likelihood is of when you're going to actually develop the lodging of that legislation?
The lodging of that legislation, I imagine, will be the first quarter of 2026.
Okay. And do you do you have a date?
If I was just going to say, but again, this is something we can take scrutiny with us.
Yes.
So in the sense of, yes, you can lodge it. From a scrutiny perspective, you may see nothing, and then we just lodge it and pass it to you. My intention would be to take you with us, so you as a scrutiny panel, would have sight of where we're going with that. Okay. So it wouldn't be just thrown on the scrutiny panel at the end when lodging takes place.
So would it be possible to have specific deadlines for each stage of this process?
We will be able to one day provide you with that. That's not today, though.
Okay. Can you give us a dedeadline as to when you will have that ready?
Or a timeline.
Or a timeline.
Yeah, so we're going through a prioritisation exercise in the context of the civil service business of government work. We've more or less concluded that. We need some sign-off from the Minister before we would publish any dates, but we've made sure that the legislative and statutory work that we've got on the books is prioritised in that. The ambition thereafter is more than ambition. What will happen thereafter is we'll, I think more effectively we've done previously in reality, turn those into effectively projects that will be, kind of, we'll have key milestones, key deliverables, key performance indicators across our standard BAU, which is an approach that we haven't had before. So I would hope within the next couple of weeks we would have some kind of sense of our anticipated timeline in the context of all of, excuse me, in the context of all of our legislation, which will give us some comfort that we can actually deliver the stuff that we're being asked to. And I think that's something that's happening across the government as well. So yeah, I think a couple of weeks we'll be in a position to get clearance that that's the priority.
Okay, I think taking the Minister's comment into consideration about bringing scrutiny with you, I think actually the transparency around that is really important.
Absolutely.
So,
I hope.
but I also think so for the industry as well, from what we've heard, is that they would like to know how things are panning out.
Absolutely. I think hopefully our approach to strategic and legislative development is changing. I think it's becoming more inclusive. We're starting to take a broader co-production approach that builds some social capital up at the beginning of the process. And as you know, we are very happy and regularly come and give informal briefings to the panel. We'd hope to continue to do that. In my experience, over the last 16 years, using effectively the scrutiny panel as a consultee in the building process is hugely helpful.
Okay.
And from the timeline perspective, part of the reason to make sure the scrutiny is working in parallel, or at least seeing in parallel, what we're doing, is that if there is slippage, you can hold us to account, and that isn't necessarily about telling you off for you're 3 weeks late, but understanding why we're 3 weeks late on something, things like that.
Absolutely.
But I guess it's an important part of that timeline. We wouldn't want to do the great reveal and it's miles away from what you would have anticipated. So there's a genuine benefit in terms of the collaboration approach in the context of the timeline as well.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. On the secondary legislation, when are you likely, given that you've indicated the first quarter of 2026, what about the secondary legislation?
So the timeline that we would create would include that. It's the secondary legislation which is the part I'm concerned about the most. And so I think what we'll have is the ideal timeline that we would like to see happen.
Yeah.
I think as we work through that timeline, as time passes, we will see more clearly whether we are going to get the secondary legislation on this side of the election or afterwards. Okay. I think that's something that will develop over time, depending on how the process works. How the success we have in keeping to the timescales.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. In terms of, we've just alluded to the role that we will have together, but what other mechanisms will be implemented to keep the Assembly and the public informed about the progress and the potential delays? I know, Dan, you just talked about the sort of co-production approach, but in general terms in the Assembly, how might you expand some of the mechanisms you've got around the communications for keeping people updated and informed?
Well, I think the main thing is ordinarily I wouldn't think the progress of your work is necessarily something that you broadcast in the Assembly. By having a co-production approach, which is the way I've approached all the legislation that I've been seeking to amend or bring in since I became Minister, the key stakeholders, in this case, principally the industry, as the key stakeholders are the ones who need to know the most, and they will be very aware because they'll be working with us on this. So this kind of partnership board will make sure that they will know what's happening. To me, they're the people who know the most. As I've mentioned, scrutiny is a function of the States Assembly, so the scrutiny panel will also know. So from that perspective, the States Assembly will know. If it wanted to actually be brought up physically in the States Assembly, I'd suggest that's a role that scrutiny play through questions. Equally, if in the worst case scenario where this isn't happening, it's not going to be done this side of the Assembly, that's the sort of place I'd suggest make a statement to the Assembly to explain why. But again, scrutiny would be quite aware of that by then anyway, because I intend to work as openly as I possibly can with scrutiny in that respect.
Okay, thank you.
We shouldn't keep you too much longer. If we go over 5 minutes, is that a problem for you?
The main issue here is just I'm very hungry.
Right, well, we're going to go for another
5
hour.
minutes.
5 minutes, that'll make that sandwich even more tasty, I think. Just pass over to Deputy Andrews.
Thank you very much, Chair. What information have you gathered so far that will probably be part of the primary legislation?
that will probably...
Be part of the primary legislation when it's being brought forward from your engagement with stakeholders?
Well, I'll ask officers on that front, but that's just part of the scoping process, which we're undertaking at the moment. So,
So we've obviously had our workshop, which was in April, I think it was. So there's a number of points there which were raised. I mean, the 4 areas we look at, there's been 2 further ones which came out of the actual document. But in reality, it's more about the actual process rather than the actual primary legislation. So it'll be more in the regulations, how the process will actually work. So the primary law will be about the what, the regulation will be the how, and that's where we will continue to have dialogue with various stakeholders, event holders, constables, parish officials as well.
Can I just ask, who turned up to the workshop?
Oh, blimey, that's a number of, I mean, there was a number of officers there from within government, from various areas, but then there was a number of event holders as well.
Okay, and any organisations such as the Hospitality?
The Hospitality Association, Visit Jersey were there as well.
Okay.
So there was a number of, I can't remember, but we had a good turnout. It was about 50 people there.
Okay, right, that's good to know. Right, thank you. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you. The last question, we're mindful of, some of this is going to come later, so it may well be something that we scrutinise, but the panel's been informed that alcohol licensing is also a key issue connected to this, and it's obviously relevant to the organisation and permitting and hosting public events. Can you outline how the future legislation might be connected with this? So, i.e., are you looking to maybe have a holistic law that you'd bring together, or would there still be 2 distinct parts?
I think at the moment we're still looking at 2 distinct parts. It had crossed my mind, but I don't think it's something to have one holistic law, but I don't think it's something we've particularly discussed, I think, at the moment, because the desire to get work done before the end of term, I think, is probably easier working in 2 separate laws. It's not something we're particularly looking at doing. Another law, which I just want to put on record, really, that we're obviously working on and changing, is the tourism law. I'm just doing that because I don't want people... This is all about hospitality in its wider sense, and I don't want anyone in the Hospitality Association to think that we've dropped the tourism law. We're working on those amendments too. But 2, I see all of them remaining as separate laws.
Yeah. And the final question, I suppose, what's certainly the final written question in front of me. We might have others, but I don't think we will. What is the time frame for production of the alcohol legislation?
That's also this side of the assembly.
Yeah, okay.
Just double check. My officers are content with that, because that's something which, that's a 1974 law.
How radical is it likely to be?
It's going to be amends. So the route we have chosen there is to amend the existing law rather than to write a new primary law. And again, that's about speed. We will see different categories of licence. I believe a consolidation, because at the moment we have 7 categories of liquor licensing. One of the areas there is to reduce the number of categories. And again, it's also about the process you go through. We need the parishes to be involved. But at the same time, I'm not a fan. It's been suggested to me that the parishes should do the licensing themselves. I'm not a fan of that personally, but there will be involvement of the parishes.
So something I mentioned before, I mean, this may be worth considering. When I talked about licensing in a particular area, one of the benefits is that, so for example, the town hall has a presumption that you can put events on there, but they can serve alcohol, but they can't sell alcohol.
Yeah.
So would you consider maybe applying a similar designation to certain areas? So, for example, the Royal Square, Howard Davis Park, you could say this is an area where alcohol can be served, but in order to sell alcohol here, you need to still go through the permit, whatever that might mean. And we've also been told that the transfer from somebody to someone else is problematic for various reasons. But are those potentially areas that you might consider holistically?
I mean, starting with the transfer of licences, that's something where we're looking to have, from an events perspective, an event, the overall event organiser being the licensee for the whole event, rather than having separate licences. So at the moment, if you go to a large event where there are 3 providers of alcohol, each of those will have a separate licence within that event.
Yeah.
We're looking to change it so that you'll just have one alcohol license for the event, even though you may have 3 providers of alcohol within there. So that's one element that we're seeking to change.
Okay.
Are you able to remind me of the first part of the question?
No, I think that's covered It's just it's talking about the areas that might be designated.
So, so again, that's a way to make it easier within the events legislation, and also it makes it easier for police. Because at the moment there is a grey area around if you serve alcohol in outlet A at a large event, also potentially outlet B, and there's an incident in the middle that isn't covered by the licensed areas, then you have issues around responsibility and things like this. So by making it just the overall responsibility of the sole event organiser, then you get rid of these grey areas. Another element, just very quickly, I'm remembering the beginning of your question, was, I think, so take the Royal Square. Yes, you could potentially license it to serve alcohol. Have an ongoing just license. You can serve alcohol in the Royal Square, and if somebody wants to have an event where they sell alcohol in the Royal Square, you could have that separately as a different license. What I would say is that when you're serving alcohol, particularly outdoors in public, you mustn't forget the kind of public order element of that. Yeah. And that's obviously the police are key stakeholders in all of this. So whilst I think what you were giving as an example would be feasible, that's where stakeholder engagement is key, because the police as a key stakeholder may have public order reasons why they don't like to give just a standing licence. Sure. I mean, I don't know, it's just an example.
I mean, one anomaly, sorry to keep this going, but if we take a parish hall, for example, you can put an event on at a parish hall and charge £100 a ticket and then have a free bar, unlimited bar, and you don't need a licence for that. But if you have a free event where you charge £10 for a glass of wine, you do need a licence for that. So there's there's kind of anomalies about that.
And again, one of the problems with drafting any laws is there are anomalies everywhere, and that's one of the difficulties. As human beings, we create anomalies. True. And when you create a law, you then create potential loopholes and things like this, if you know what I mean. So that's one of the difficulties with creating new laws.
Yeah, just one final, if I could. What's coming out of your initial feedback from your stakeholder consultations?
The main one is a willingness to get on with it and want to see a significant, simpler process to take place. We asked, basically, I mean, one of the things you'll get from us, we asked at the beginning of this process. Working with those stakeholders in a way that they feel empowered as well, whether it's the police or whether it's an event organiser, that they feel that they have been listened to, that their concerns are included, is kind of one of the main takeaways that we have at the moment.
Okay, all right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have you got anything you want to ask us or any clarification?
No, not from my perspective, other than to thank you as a panel for taking an interest. And I really do look forward to working with you guys on this. The questions, again, just immediately from having had an hour of questions, is you've already raised some areas that I hadn't thought of, and that's exactly why it's so important to work together with people, because certainly one person, but even one department can't think of all the possible options and the possible questions. So thank you.
No, so it's really for us to thank you for coming in, Minister, and thank you to your officers for giving up your time. We know you're all very busy, so we do appreciate that.
You're welcome.
And if it's okay, we'll draw the meeting